Good evening. I'm Ann Toback, CEO of the Workers' Circle, and welcome to Power to the People, where we go from here. It's been 1 week since the presidential election, and the threats to American democracy are growing daily. It's clear we, the people, must be both the bulwark and the compass for our democracy. Tonight, we will explore the power we have to fight forward together for an American democracy that is accountable to the people, that values pluralism, and that champions freedom. The Workers' Circle is a national social justice organization rooted in Jewish culture and founded by Eastern European immigrants who fled autocracy and pogroms for democratic freedoms more than a century ago. That history drives our work for democracy and human equality today. Collective activism has long been the hallmark of how the Workers' Circle advances social change. We know that working together in strong partnerships is how we will all achieve the national change we need. That's why we are so pleased that 30 organizations are co-sponsoring this virtual conversation tonight. You can see them all listed in the chat. We are proud to be standing in solidarity with so many incredible organizations. Tonight's program will begin with a 30-minute conversation among our panelists, and then we will provide ample time for questions from you. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we can tonight. And now, allow me to introduce Noelle Damico, Director of Social Justice at the Workers' Circle, who will introduce our speakers and get the conversation going. Welcome, Noelle.
Thank you, Anne. Friends, we are gathering at a moment that is unprecedented in American history. The stakes couldn't be higher for our democratic governance and society, with the return of Donald J. Trump to the office of president and likely MAGA control over all three branches of government. Buoyed to victory on a sea of propaganda and wrapped in a new cloak of presidential immunity, courtesy of the Supreme Court, Trump has already told us what to expect from his administration: loyalty to him over the Constitution, and a swift implementation of Project 2025, a sweeping blueprint for the first 100 days in office that includes using the military to deport millions of undocumented immigrants and weaponizing the Justice Department to go after political opponents. The MAGA movement has now nearly swallowed the Republican Party whole, and its dominance is fueled by billionaires whose fidelity is to their own profit and power rather than our nation. This is not the first time in history that fascists have risen to power through democratic means. As a Jewish organization, you can imagine we do not use the word fascist or fascism lightly. We use it so that we can accurately describe what it is we're fighting. We're leaning on historians like Timothy Snyder, Jason Stanley, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who remind us of why demagogues demand loyalty and use us and them rhetoric to dehumanize the most vulnerable communities. The goal is to foster fear and compliance. So let's pledge tonight not to give them either. Workers' Circle members have resisted fascism before, and we know that when we stand together, we can forge a way forward for freedom, even in the darkest times. Tonight, it is my honor to welcome our conversation partners who will help us think with seriousness about this moment and the power that we hold to forge the America we must become. We welcome Ari Berman, award-winning journalist at Mother Jones, author and voting rights expert, whose book Minority Rule has served as a trusted map for navigating these tumultuous waters. He is a frequent commentator on MSNBC and NPR. Welcome, Ari.
Good evening. Thank you, Noelle.
You bet. We welcome Andrea Miller, founder of the Center for Common Ground and grassroots mobilizing powerhouse. Andrea has helped so many organizations, phone bank and postcard, Canvas and text bank, to reach millions of voters of color in partnership with organizations on the ground in voter suppression states. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you.
And finally, we welcome Marge Baker, Executive Vice President at People for the American Way and a courts expert. Awash in credentials, Marge is no ivory tower expert. I met Marge for the first time on the front lines doing civil disobedience in the fall of 2021 outside the White House, demanding President Biden lay aside the filibuster to protect voting rights. Welcome, Marge.
Thank you.
Well, let's dive right in. The title of our conversation contains the phrase, "Where do we go from here?" Andrea, Marge, and Ari, what is the here in which we find ourselves on November 12, 2024? I'd like you to look at the landscape in which we're moving post-election. What are some of the hallmarks of this political moment? Is there something that we're not discussing in the public square right now that you believe it's important for us to notice? Ari, let's start with you.
Well, thank you everyone for having me, and it's great to be here with you guys. It's making me feel a little bit better seeing all the participants below and where everyone's coming from. I am still processing the results, as I know everyone else is. So this is going to be one of those conversations where I'm not sure any of us has the exact coherent answers at this moment in time, and can tell you it's exactly Germany in 1933 or Louisiana in 1897 or wherever. I mean, there's lots of different historical parallels. There have been no shortage of takes after the election and no shortage of commentary about why Harris lost or why Trump won. What I want to reflect on is one stat that really stood out to me on election night, which was that 34% of voters, which was the highest number, said that the state of democracy was their number one issue. And I saw that finding in exit polls, and I said, Harris is going to win. If democracy is the number one issue on her mind, then she's going to win the election, because that is the issue that she has emphasized more than anything else. And you know what? 80% of voters that said that democracy was their top issue did in fact vote for Kamala Harris. So if your top issue was democracy, you were much more likely to vote for Harris. The problem was that people who voted on every other issue, except for abortion, voted for Trump, whether it was the economy or it was immigration or it was foreign policy, and they did contradictory things. For example, a majority of Americans said that they believed that we should not have mass deportation, but they voted for someone who said that he would do mass deportation on day one. A majority of voters said that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Those voters that said that abortion should be legal in most cases, those voters split between Harris and Trump, 49 for 49. So you had a very large segment of voters say that abortion should be legal in most cases, and then vote for the guy who appointed the justices that overturned Roe v. Wade. And what that tells me, the fact that, yes, democracy was the biggest issue, but it was not the issue that decided in and of itself the election, tells me that it didn't resonate with enough people. If you look at the turnout, Trump barely got more votes than he did in 2020. Harris got many fewer votes than Joe Biden did. So the story of the election was the people who didn't show up. And the people who didn't show up were much more likely to be Democratic voters than Republican voters. And there's a lot of facts that go into why that might have been. I'm sure racism, sexism, lots of issues go into that. But I think there's another issue, which is that a lot of people feel like democracy is broken. And a lot of people feel like democracy is not working for them right now. And the message they heard coming from the Democrats was that we need to preserve American democracy. Well, if you don't believe that the democratic system is working, you're not all that interested in preserving American democracy. So to me, what's missing is that we don't just need to preserve American democracy, we need to reform and fix American democracy. There are very concrete reasons why democracy is not working for people. There's structural impediments to democracy. There's too much money in the system. There's all sorts of choke points for minority rule built into it. And that whole part of it was not explained to people. So we need to make, in the next 4 years, there's going to be a lot of things that need to do in terms of trying to resist, as you said, creeping fascism. But I think on a larger scale, we need to think about how do we make democracy relevant to as many people as possible? How do we connect it to the ordinary struggles that people are feeling in their lives? And how do we lay out a future in which we don't just preserve the status quo, but ultimately build something better?
Thank you so much, Ari. I think that's one of the reasons in the Workers' Circle we talk about demanding democracy rather than defending democracy, because we recognize in many ways democracy is yet to become what has been long promised. And so let me turn, Andrea, to you. You've been on the front lines in this election, working at the grassroots, making sure voters have the information they need, especially voters fighting back and fighting their way through voter suppression laws. What are you seeing as the here that in the where do we go from here?
Well, again, good evening, Noelle, and thank you very much for including me. I'm going to take a slightly different tack. We won in Virginia. We won in rural Alabama in CD2, and we won in the rural Black Belt of North Carolina. So one of the conversations that I think it becomes very important to have is what was different about the state of Virginia. We are now the only solidly progressive state in the South, and we are surrounded by conservatives to our south and to our west. When we look at Alabama, absolutely no one wanted to pay attention to Alabama. This was the new majority minority district, and a lot of people didn't want to work with us this year because they were saying, well, if you're turning out the Black voters are going to vote for Trump. And as a whole, that just was not true. So consequently, a lot of people didn't bother reaching out to Black voters and making sure they had the information that they needed in order to be able to go and vote. So I'm the voice of let's take a look at what we did that worked and let's do that some more. One of the other important here is our next elections are not in 2026. They are next year in 2025, starting with the Wisconsin Supreme Court primary in February of 2025.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. We're going to keep that in mind. I know so many organizations here tonight worked to provide nonpartisan information to voters that were on the ground that needed to navigate through voter suppression laws that have been passed recently. Thank you. Marge, what is the here in which we find ourselves right now?
So the here is something I'm really struggling with, and I think it is really, really important. I totally agree with the fact that we have to talk about building or perfecting our democracy. That's why we engaged in the civil disobedience, because that was part of it. And I totally agree that we have to not discount voters. We have to treat every voter as real and a serious voter, and don't discount them based on whatever our assumptions are. But what bothers me about what we're missing in this conversation right now is, number one, there is going to be real harm to real people. And we have got to focus on that. So we have to focus on what we can do to ameliorate that harm as much as we can. And it's got to be a community-wide effort. The second thing that really troubles me is that the number of voters that either ignore or accepted the brutality, the demonizing, the throwing whole communities under the bus, and it is totally disturbing and something we have to focus on. The hatred that was normalized is just it's unconscionable, and we have to figure out how to address that. And then could I just add one thing? I don't want to take too long, but also what's missing for me is the inspiration of Kamala Harris's candidacy. A very, very quick story. I'll try to make this short. I work with a wonderful, wonderful, incredibly talented, brilliant young Black woman. And she and her daughter, I think 6-year-old daughter, were at our election night watch party. It was a virtual party. And her daughter didn't want to go home until they figured out until the election was declared. And they had to leave early. Well, they left at 11, it wasn't done. Went to sleep. The next morning, her daughter got up, and my colleague had to say, well, unfortunately, Kamala didn't win. And then her daughter said, well, who won? And she said, well, Donald Trump. And then her daughter went out of the room, came back, and said, Mommy, you're going to be 35 next year. Can you run for president? And that for me was it just totally encapsulated what we've lost, was the inspiration of this candidacy. And in all of the conversation, what went wrong, let's hold on to that, because it's really important. For me, it's what makes me feel inspired to keep fighting.
Well, part of what we want to look at is not just what went wrong, but how we move forward. And I know I'm seeing people in the chat. When are you going to get to that? We have one question before we get to that. Here's the other question I want to put forward to each of you. This election season was really unlike any that we've had before. Americans' phones and radios and social media were flooded 24/7 by disinformation, by MAGA leaders and their acolytes. And much of what I will call propaganda, because it was non-factual information, came this time not only through Fox, but through social media and right-wing podcasters like Joe Rogan, who focused on cultural narratives and heroes, who boosted one another's messages. And so in this slide, you can see some of the effects of this. To make it worse, evidence-based media Post, the New York Times, the LA Times often repeated the framing of these right-wing podcasters and posts, and we can see what it meant in terms of how people voted. And this is some Reuters information. People who were concerned about the economy and the inflation and crime and increased border crossings voted for Republicans because they received messages that were not accurate from the right wing. Further, the mainstream media presented two candidates as if they were neutral, as if there was some ordinary election going on, and both candidates were sometimes making misstatements when nothing could be further from the case. Of course, driving home the posture of this neutrality was the LA Times and Washington Post, who are owned by billionaires, deciding they would not weigh in with an endorsement in this election. So even when there is truthful evidence-based reporting going on, and I'm thinking of some of the groundbreaking work you've done, Ari, and others at Mother Jones, at ProPublica, the vast majority of people are not listening to it, or it's getting overwhelmed by the flood of propaganda on other channels. Of course, all of this is lavishly funded by billionaires who stood to gain influence and benefit with the Trump election. So this is the water we're swimming in. This is the air we're breathing. How do we effectively combat this? How do we break through to ordinary Americans? Andrea, I'm actually going to start with you on this one.
Well, one of the things that we've been talking about are, because we work very hard to work with regular people, we work with a lot of low-income people, is finding voices from these communities and elevating these voices within their community. So I had this conversation this morning with Deepak and with Janice about what we can do and how we let people know that these are their peers who are talking. Because what we found is when we went into communities, even if they had gotten a lot of misinformation from national news, if there was someone from their community that they knew and they trusted that said, well, did you know, or haven't you heard about, people were willing to listen.
Thank you, Andrea. That's so important to keep in mind the power of the connections we have locally and our ability to encounter our neighbors and really shift that narrative. Marge, I'm going to turn to you. Your thoughts on this difficulty we're facing right now.
Yeah, I totally agree with Andrea. I think this is one-on-one. This is one-on-one communication. You can't do it just in an election cycle. You've got to build community, and I think that's what this community is doing, is building community. That's what we have to do, one-on-one. Find the influencers, whether they're face-to-face influencers, they might be influencers online, but people that you trust and you have a relationship with, and it's not just they know that people understand the source that it's coming from, and there's a relationship behind it. I think that is just so important.
Thanks, Marge. Ari, as the journalist and reporter and on the scene here, I'm really interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, I think you have to go back probably to William Randolph Hearst to find someone who's played as destructive as a role as Elon Musk has. And I think it's probably a lot worse with Musk, because you're talking about the fact that he was a huge donator to Trump's campaign. I think Trump took something like $500 million from 4 donors alone, which is astonishing. And then he was leading all of the disinformation at the same time. In 2020, when Trump lied about mail voting and things like that, it was flagged as inaccurate. And this time it was spreading in rapid numbers. And I think that had a real impact on the election. I think it undermined people's faith in the democratic system. I think it told people to stay home, sort of like Russian interference did in 2016. And I also think that it persuaded a lot of people to vote for Trump who might have not voted for him otherwise, believing things that weren't true. I think it gets back to having to meet people wherever they are. So you really need an all of the above media strategy. You have to recognize that whatever is going viral online one day might not be the thing that people necessarily care about in other communities, that there's sometimes a disconnect between what might be discussed on MSNBC or what might be discussed on social media and what people are talking about every day. And I think maybe there was things going on in the country that we failed to grasp because we were only consuming certain kind of media or only paying attention to certain kind of people. But I think we're reaching a crisis for democracy with what's happening with the media. As Andrea said, because people didn't have trusted local sources, because they couldn't rely on their local newspaper, for example, anymore for coverage, they turned to things like Twitter or like Facebook or other things where misinformation and disinformation spread. And so I think that investing in media, investing in local media, I don't just say this as a journalist, but as someone who cares about outcomes ultimately, that has to be part of a protecting democracy strategy.
Okay. Thanks, Ari. A question to all of you. How do we make the best use of the time we have now until January 20th, 2025? What do you think are the most important things we should be doing right now? Should it be trying to get the freedom to vote bill through Congress? Does that make sense? That would ban a lot of this dark money and contributions that we're talking about that are so distorting our democracy. What is the best way do you think that we can use this particular time? And I'm going to start, Ari, with you. We'll go right back to you first.
Well, I'm going to say what I think Marge is going to expand on, which is judges, 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 because
Yeah.
there, I think, are something like 20 something nominees pending right now on the federal courts. And that should be the number one thing, because that's something where I think that has been the most damaging legacy of Donald Trump, are the judges that he's put on the court. And I just want to say one thing, which is, imagine how different this election might have been if Trump actually had gone to trial in Florida and in Washington, D.C. for taking classified documents, and more importantly, for inciting an insurrection. And it was the judges that he put on the bench and their allies who prevented that from happening. And if you had described a scenario in which someone had tried to overturn an election, had been indicted for it, and then had gotten off the hook because of the judges that he confirmed, that's the kind of authoritarian thing you'd think would be happening in some place other than the United States. So it was an incredibly corrupt action. It was normalized by the media and so many other people as the judicial process just working, as opposed to just an example of rampant authoritarianism. And at the very least, we can try to prevent some of those judicial openings from being filled by the next Eileen Cannons of the world.
Thanks, Ari. Marge, let's go to you next.
Yeah, Ari's right. That's what I'm going to talk about. Judges, judges, judges. It is so important. My colleague of mine said it could be that the most important thing we do over the next 4 years will happen in the next 2 months. There are at least 26 lower court judicial nominees on the Senate calendar or pending in committee that can be voted on by the end of this year if the Senate Democrats put their mind to it. It can be done. And it's just going to take a lot of time. It's going to take working through all of the obstruction that we'll see. You know it's important because Donald Trump and Elon Musk are out there saying, don't confirm these folks. These judges the judges that President Biden has nominated to the bench and gotten confirmed are the most exceptional I have ever seen, and I've been doing this work a long time. They are diverse beyond measure. They are civil rights advocates, workers' rights advocates, LGBTQ quality advocates, consumer advocates. It is amazing to see the quality of these judges on the bench, and we have the opportunity to get at least 26 more on. So if there is something folks want to do right now, and we can, I think, put the action for you in the chat, is you can call your senators, tell them to confirm the pending judicial nominees in the Senate, leave no judge behind. If your senators are Republican senators who you think won't listen to you, then direct those calls to Senator Schumer, who is the majority leader of the Senate. We can get this done. Just by comparison, 14 Trump nominees were confirmed in the lame duck session of the election he lost, including Eileen Cannon, the infamous Florida District Court judge who tanked the documents case. So we can go on and on. The judges who sit on these lower courts do an incredible job of delivering justice every day for all of us. And we need judges on the bench who will look out for the interests of all of us, not just the rich, not just the powerful. So if there's one thing you can do, weigh in now. We have this week, next week in November, and 3 weeks in December. We can get it done, but they got to put the pedal to the metal. They got to stay in and get it done. That is one of the most important things.
Thanks so much, Marge. Andrea, let's turn to you. What's the most important thing we can focus on now?
This is incredibly important and very, very doable. Tell President Biden to publish the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Let's add gender equality to the United States Constitution, because once it is done and it is in the United States Constitution, Mr. Trump cannot say, nope, take it out. If he wants to remove it, they are going to have to go through the full amendment process, get it through both houses. He has to sign it, and then 38 states need to ratify it. So while President Biden has the power of king, he needs to cement his legacy. We lost Roe on his watch. This election went totally south on his watch. He needs to reclaim his legacy, publish the Equal Rights Amendment. The American Bar Association, in a memo where they agreed unanimously, who knows any group of attorneys who all agree on anything, but they agreed on this. All of the process for making the Equal Rights Amendment the 28th Amendment have been met. 38 states have ratified, and the only thing left to do is publish. A phone call, a note to the archivist, stand outside the window and go, yo, that's all we need. We need 10 minutes of his time.
Thanks so much, Andrea. We're going to turn to our last question now before going to our participants tonight. And those of you who are in the chat, keep putting your questions in. We're going to get to as many of them as we possibly can. For the last 4 years, the Worker Circle has said over and over, we the people must be the bulwark of our democracy, that we have an active role in fostering democratic government and society. We must not resign ourselves to being spectators. It's one of the reasons the Worker Circle launched the Democracy Circles program and organizing strategy, where groups of people across the country are actively learning about challenges to our democracy, building local relationships, and acting nationally for shared goals together. And we're going to be dropping the Democracy Circles link so you can learn more about that into the chat. Those American voters who did vote, and we know a whole lot of them didn't. Some were prevented by new state voter suppression laws. Some didn't feel democracy worked for them. But the majority of American people who voted to give MAGA leaders control over mostly the three branches of government. It's looking like that. What are the forms of power and actions that we, the people, should be looking at in light of this? Let me add, I don't think this is an easy question. This isn't just hashtag resistance into the streets. Take action by signing this petition or doing this thing to say we don't agree. We really need to grapple with the loss of certain political levers that we had, and from tried and true advocacy, we need to think about how we can build new alliances. We have to build those alliances across parties. Worker Circle is a nonpartisan organization. What we're focused on is how can every person and how also can every party help build and cement our democracy. So we need to think about how do we build alliances and not draw our boundaries maybe too righteously. We need to prepare ourselves also for what's coming, to think about the responsibilities we have and what we're prepared to sacrifice. I'd also suggest to think about whether we need to wonder, is our target audience really the federal government? Or might it be to those Americans who have felt left out of this process or left out even of the coalitions that we've already built? Help us think and consider how we take in this serious moment our people power seriously. What can this look like moving forward? Marge, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is a really, really important question and one I'm still struggling with. And I think as far as I've gotten is, number one, got to stay grounded in your values. What's important, okay? So be driven by that. And then I think we all each have to find our point of leverage. For me, my point of leverage, because of the work I do, is trying to lobby and trying to influence the senators and, who are going to vote on nominations, for example. For other people, it may well be your school board, or it may be your city council, or it may be your state legislator. And so I think take stock of what it is that you want to accomplish, we think can be accomplished, and then what are your own points of leverage. And at some time, our point of leverage is literally just to resist and to do whatever we can to use our leverage to say no. And again, where can we do that and how do we do that? And then also just really, really important is find your allies. The thing that has gotten me through the last week is all of the allies, everybody who is in this. Everybody who's in this, our members, people on this panel, people on other panels I've been in, coalitions I'm in, everybody's working on this. There aren't any right answers, but we just have to make sure we're using those allies as best we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Marge. Let me turn to Ari next.
Well, I think we can try to prevent the worst of the worst. I think it's going to be hard to do much affirmative good at the federal level, but try to prevent the worst things from happening, help the people that are most affected by those policies. It's the most vulnerable communities, those people that are going to be on the receiving end of so much of this extreme agenda. And then I think if the federal government feels hopeless, I think about ways to take it back, as Andrea said, that starts in 2025 and then continues into 2026, but also organize locally to amplify Marge's point. There's been so much important organizing work at the state level. That's really where the resistance to Trump began, with all of the efforts at the local level. And states have really become laboratories of democracy in a lot of ways. And even when Trump was improving his vote margins, abortion ballot initiatives were passing in 7 of 10 states. Things like the New York Equal Rights Amendment. Lots of down ballot candidates were winning in spite of a major national red move. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities at the state level. I think the states are probably going to be the most viable place of resistance, both in terms of standing up to Trump, but also trying to build a better kind of democracy that then could eventually be exported to Washington. But it's clearly not going to be Washington, the states. It's going to be state and local communities trying to create the resistance that then can ultimately influence what's happening in Washington.
Noelle, could I also say it's really important to tell the story of why we're resisting, why we're fighting, right? It's not in the abstract. We are resisting because we care about healthcare, gun safety, clean water, abortion rights, and protecting our environment. There's real reasons. That's sort of our value. There's real reasons why we're making this fight, and so tell us stories of that, because I think it actually gives us more leverage.
Yeah, thank you, Marge. Andrea, let me turn it to you.
Well, as the grassroots, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to build locally, as everyone has said, to harness that energy and to look at our structures at the county level and at the state level. Our states are in a much better position to resist than we are as individuals or as small groups. So that is one of the reasons why the Virginia statewide elections in 2025 and the entire Virginia House are very, very, very important. That is why the Wisconsin Supreme Court race is important. We are going to need our state and local structures to be that first bulwark of defense. In other words, they become the doors that people are going to have to go through if they are going to go after our immigrant brothers and sisters, if they are going to go after women who have lost a child due to miscarriage. So those structures are going to be even more important than they previously have been. And one of the problems with one of the parties has been they have always concentrated all their efforts and their assets at the federal level, and they have ignored state and local.
Thanks, Andrea. In fact, this discussion about states leads us to the first question from our audience tonight. Could a good use of our time between now and January 20th, 2025 be to request that state attorneys general use their good offices and each of their state constitutions individually and collectively to protect their state's citizens' civil liberties from overreach by the executive branch? What do you all think of that proposal?
Well, we had done something like that previously in Virginia when we had a good attorney general. So we're going to have to get rid of the one we have and actually get a good one. And so that is a possibility. We don't have that many states where there are going to be good attorney generals. There are some, but when I look, Virginia South, actually North Carolina, but otherwise, no, not in the South. So we're depending on the North, Northeast, and the West, and the Central, Illinois, Michigan, maybe even Wisconsin. But once that election happens, a lot of that goes away.
Let me go to Ari. I saw you getting in on this.
Yeah, I just looked it up. 25 states have a Democratic attorney generals. So that's a pretty good number, including some really big states, obviously New York and California, and also some really important swing states, places like Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina. So I think that's going to be critically important. State attorney generals, secretaries of state on voting, democracy, other issues, state Supreme Courts on a lot of issues. What I wrote about a lot in my last book is that after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, Republicans really made the states their focus on contracting and constricting American democracy. And I think that the opposite's going to have to occur now. Democrats are going to have to make the states their laboratories for protecting and expanding democracy. And that's the most viable place for it right now. It's the most doable. And it also then provides a model and momentum to make it feel like people, first off, to help people, to make it feel like good things are still happening, and then ultimately to build momentum for those kind of policies at the federal level as well when you get another opportunity for those elections.
I think that's right. I think midterms during the Obama administration, we lost a lot of state power, and I think we've been rebuilding that, and I think it's really critical. And I think as folks in the chat have noticed, I think there's a lot of work going on among the progressive attorneys general to focus on what they can do and the protections. And I think this is not just between now and January. This is for the next 4 years that we have to do this, and so we have to. And again, this is about who's got the power, what are the levers of power to make a difference in terms of protecting our rights and protecting, frankly, those have been most marginalized and are going to be most affected.
Thanks, Marge. We've got a few questions about voter suppression. One person is asking, is voter suppression real? Another person is saying, please, please talk about voter suppression and the voter purges that have been enacted, especially since 2020. What can we do about this at this point? So for those of you who don't know, the Supreme Court in 2013, in a decision called Shelby v. Holder, cut out the heart of pre-clearance, which was the beating heart of the Voting Rights Act, that required states with long histories of voter suppression to have any changes to voting and election law pre-cleared or passed by for approval by the federal government. When that left, within 24 hours, Texas passed a voter ID law. Since then, more than 100 laws have been passed in more than a majority of the states. Andrea, I'm going to kick this over to you. What can we do about voter suppression right now? Because without dealing with the voter suppression laws and the voter purging that have been going on, when individuals come and challenge a person's ability and right to vote and get them removed from registrations, this is going to continue to dog us.
Well, we need to always education. I saw in the chat, educate is really, really critical. One of the things that we saw here in Virginia with this election is many colleges and many college students really did not understand the laws as it relates to voter registration. We had students showing up on election day wanting to vote at the registrar's office. Virginia, you can register and vote the same day. During early voting, it's at the early voting locations. On election day, it's at your polling location. Voters get purged from southern states for not voting. When we register voters, we need to help them understand there's a trick in this process. If you don't vote as often as the people in charge of elections in your state believe you should, they are going to kick you off the rolls. We also have to work on educating voters to make sure you remain registered. So once you are registered, you need to check your voter registration status every quarter. Make sure some random person hasn't shown up at an unfriendly board of elections and given them a list and your name was on it, and they're saying they shouldn't be registered to vote here. So we need to know the law, and then we have to go into our vulnerable communities and make sure they understand where they are most vulnerable and they have a plan. So we are now literally talking about we have to bring the voting rules directly to individuals. And most individuals do not understand the voting rules and the tricks and traps that are part of voting. I was writing in the chat some examples of voter suppression. Alabama, Mississippi, several other states have no early voting whatsoever. You can vote on election day. Texas allows one drop box per county. North Carolina bans all drop boxes. The ability to vote, the methodologies to vote, it is not equal, it is not even. North Carolina even gives you a list of, if you are old and you don't have the ability to go and bring your own ballot back, they have a list of who can bring it back for you. So voter suppression is very much alive and well. Think of it in the southern states, and even to some degree, there are little things in central states and even states like Missouri.
Certainly. And I know Cleta Mitchell has empowered really an army of grassroots activists to bring these voter challenges. So again, friends, this is all about the grassroots, because these challenges come at local boards of elections, right? So it's very hard to have a top-down strategy to deal with this. So it's important that we educate our neighbors about this. I want to bring up a completely different topic. And Ari, this question is for you. Can you discuss the how we can change the Electoral College so that every state is like Maine and Nebraska? How can we bring out voters if they really believe their vote isn't going to matter because of the Electoral College?
I think that's one really big problem with the Electoral College is that the election is always decided by a half dozen or so swing states. This year was decided by 7 swing states that represented 15% of the country, meaning that 85% of the country really felt like their vote didn't matter. And so it's unrepresentative, it's obviously undemocratic, it violates basic notions of one person, one vote, it's very antiquated. And so to get rid of it would require 2 things. One would be a constitutional amendment to do that. That's very hard because it requires 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states, or there's more promising, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is basically where states that eventually add up to 270 electoral college votes pledge to appoint the winner of their state's electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. Right now, that's at 209 electoral votes, so it's short, it's 61 votes short of 270, but that's still a lot closer than a constitutional amendment. There are states that are controlled by Democrats, like in Michigan, for example, where it could theoretically pass in the lame duck session. There's other places where it could be on the table. So that's another reason why state control, state legislatures, gubernatorial races matter a lot, because they could then sign on to this interstate compact. And I get that, yes, Trump did win the popular vote. He also campaigned heavily in places like New York where Kamala Harris didn't. So I think that if Kamala Harris had tried to win the popular vote, she probably would have. But even regardless of who wins the popular vote, just the idea that you could have a split between the popular vote and the Electoral College, the idea that 7 states instead of the entire country should decide the presidency, that in and of itself should be a reason to get rid of it. It suppresses turnout nationwide, and it suppresses turnout in local races too, because if people aren't voting for the presidential race, they're unlikely to then turn out for congressional races, state legislative races, down ballot races, because the presidency is what draws so many people to the polls in the first place.
That's exactly right. We're a strong supporter of national popular vote, and we work with a network of young progressive elected officials around the country who really see popular vote as a way to bring out voters for the down ballot races as well. It really does take some organizing, but it is actually doable, and it's the same kind of organizing we've been talking about. Yeah.
Let me put another question on the table to try to get as many from the audience as we can to you all. This question is partly a statement. It says, now that Trump has the judicial and legislative branches in his pocket, he'll definitely get rid of career civil servants and replace with political cronies in the executive branch. We won't have our usual legal tools or checks or balances on his unfettered power. How do we protect our at-risk communities during this difficult time?
I don't have the answer for that, and it really scares me the most. I think one is we've got to call attention to what's going on. We've got to be very, very clear. We can't let the narrative all about what happened and the sort of, who's in charge and what happened in the elections deflect us from considering the impact of what's going on. So I think one is just shining a spotlight on it. 2, I know there are a number of organizations that have litigators ready to go to do what they can to protect the individuals who are harmed in this way. And I think there's a question of providing the moral support to understand that individuals are being demonized and dehumanized because of their values, and that's just not okay. So we have to keep calling that out from every platform that we have.
I know that the Workers' Circle, for example, has relationships with immigrant right groups. And so what we're going to be doing is looking to those groups to let us know what they need from us at this time. And I'm sure many of you that are on this Zoom can find in your own community those groups that are working with highly vulnerable populations right now. And you can ask a simple question: what can we do to be most helpful to you? The folks on the grounds are often those who really know what's best for themselves. And so I'd just add that into the mix. Someone is begging, please address presidential immunity. How do we balance our civil rights and liberties with that now in play? Any thoughts on this, panelists? It's a real problem.
I honestly don't have an answer to that, and it truly scares me. Yeah, I think there's legislative efforts to overturn portions of it. And pushing for legislation is fine, and we know the reality that in this trifecta situation, it's not going to happen. I honestly don't have an answer to that, but I think we have to be vigilant, and we have to again put a spotlight on the ways in which the lawlessness that we are going to see harms people, and it harms real people. And we've just got to keep our focus on that. These are going to be hard times, and we have to be there for one another, and we have to tell the stories. We have to tell the stories of the harm being done, and we will prevail. We will, but it's going to be a long fight.
It is. Ari, come in. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I think to add on to Marge's point, I think one of the things we really have to do is it's going to be so chaotic and there's going to be so many extreme policies coming at once that we really have to not normalize this and just keep pointing out how radical and extreme this is. I just saw that Trump just picked a Fox News host to be defense secretary. I mean, just like stuff like that is just so crazy. And I think one of the reasons why Trump won was because so much of the media normalized him in the first place and treated someone who tried to overturn an election and incite insurrection and did all these things as a normal kind of candidate because he was nominated through the normal kind of processes. And this was extremely abnormal. And I worry that now because Trump won with what is described as some kind of mandate, they're going to normalize his actions, say that he has the right to do whatever he wants, but that's not how it works. Like, you don't get to get 51% of the vote and then just govern like a dictator. We have a system in which you're not allowed to be a dictator on day one or any other days, despite what the Supreme Court has. So I just think that trying to point out, as Marge said, the crazy things he's doing, but then talk about how it affects people's lives. Because so many people voted for Trump because of the price of eggs or other bread and butter issues. And instead, they're going to get mass deportation, purging the government of all competent people, an extreme right-wing Christian nationalist agenda. I don't think that's what most people voted for. I believe that's what Trump's MAGA base voted for, but I don't believe that's what the people who swung the election ultimately voted for. So they have to be convinced of a different kind of scenario. I know people in the chat are saying that they disagree with me, but listen, it wasn't 51% of the population, or Trump would have had those people before. This was the only election in which he got a majority of votes. So clearly, people who didn't support him in 2016 and didn't support him in 2020 voted for him or stayed home in 2024. It's not a majority of Americans for the MAGA agenda, and I think you just have to keep reminding people of that.
Well, and I think we can think about those people who are having second thoughts. Like, we don't write anybody off here. It's really important that, because people are going to be coming to terms, no matter how they voted, with the political reality before them. And I think as people who are really dedicated to a pluralist democracy, that we have to keep reaching out and keep being ready, keep planting the seeds, so that when people find this isn't what they signed up for, there's a ready community that is going to welcome them and respect them and be ready to work together with them. We're nearing the end of our time, and I want to give you each a very quick final thought to our audience before we go. But I want you to answer this question that is the last one from our audience at the same time. I truly want to know how the organizers and panelists on this call remain so energetic and hopeful. Do you ever just cry and break down and lose hope? How do you find the motivation and fortitude to continue? Ari, let's start with you.
No, I just put on a happy face for Zoom and then scream at a punching bag the minute I get off. No, I mean, I think it's helpful to realize that as bad as things are, these things are often temporary, that there's been a lot of dark moments in American history before that we've eventually gotten out of. You know, I've been hanging out with my kids who are 10 and 6. They're blissfully unaware of a lot of things that are happening, so I try to enjoy that moment with them. I'm taking long walks with my dog in the woods and realizing that, you know, as bad as things are, the sun is still shining. I still have the land, I still have the earth, I still have nature, I still have community. So I think that just sort of appreciating the smaller things sometimes can get us through these big existential crises that we're facing.
Thanks, Ari. Marge, I'm going to go to you next.
I do it for my grandkids, my grandnephews. I see in them the future, and it keeps me going. And you know, you have ups and downs, but if you keep your eye on that North Star where you're trying to get, and we've done a lot of work thinking about that, keep your eye on the North Star, and then be in collaboration and community with folks who share those values. You get through, and we absolutely will.
Andrea, you have the final word.
Well, my great-grandfather was a slave, and I look at where I am now, and I understand there is a path backwards and a path forward. I deliberately choose the path forward. And because I choose the path forward, that means that when I get up in the morning, I have to believe that what I am doing is making a difference, and I have to keep doing it, and I have to figure out a way to make it better.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Ari. And thank you, Marge. Tonight, we've been reminded that we, the people, have the power to shape America's future. And we want to thank the three of you. We want to thank our co-sponsors. We thank our ASL interpreter. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us. You know, we had over 2,100 people register for this Zoom tonight, which tells us that we are not alone, that we share these concerns and we share a desire to get to work. You will receive an email with a link to the recording and resources for action in the next day or so, and please use that email. Please share it with others. Look, we know that what lies ahead will demand more of us. And so as we close, I want to echo the cry of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is Mir seinen Do. We are here. We are here. We are here to resist. We are here to build. We are here for one another. We are here for our democracy. We are here. On behalf of the Workers' Circle, good night, and we'll see you on the front lines.